My name is Jigar Shah and I'm an enterprise solutions architect. I am also a global community speaker. You can follow me on Jigar Shah 189, which is my LinkedIn and Twitter handle. Um, so today, what are we really going to talk about as a part of our advanced Apex triggers? Okay, so there are a few things that we're going to specifically look at in conjunction, or this is more of an extension to our earlier episode where Amit talked about building triggers and what are the artifacts that are available from the Salesforce side to build out triggers. So today we're going to be talking about when we build some of these triggers, right? As we spoke last, they have certain challenges, and we're going to be talking about them in detail to understand what those challenges are. And in order to obtain a solution or solve these particular challenges that are available with triggers, we need to look at trigger patterns, right? So we'll try to understand what trigger patterns are. We'll uh, try to dissect what a trigger pattern looks like. We have a specific trigger pattern that we're going to be talking about today. And then we're going to go into writing a trigger which has already been written in the regular format, but then we're going to use a trigger pattern and uh, restructure that trigger as per this new pattern so as to understand its benefits. Last but not the least, we're going to be understanding the order of execution, which is a very important aspect in understanding how triggers really work. And uh, of course, it is a very helpful concept in writing efficient triggers, right? Um, just some housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic uh, and please keep adding questions in the Q&A window. We'll try to answer them in the last 15 minutes, but just feel free to ask questions and make sure you make the most of this session. So typically so in our last session, Amit talked about how triggers can be implemented. So typically triggers are nothing but pieces of code that can be written or that fire when any kind of DML operation occurs, right? Uh, and when I say a DML operation, it it is basically any kind of data manipulation that happens. So if whether you're inserting a record within an object in Salesforce, or whether you're updating or modifying a record, or if you're deleting a record, you can write triggers to fire on some of these events. And this is how generally triggers are written, right? So we have a very common syntax of writing a trigger where you define the object and the events in your regular trigger implementations. But there is a challenge or an issue with this regular technique that we spoke last about on writing triggers. So let's just understand and let's just understand this with an example. So let me just switch back. I'm going to switch over to my Salesforce instance, right? Let me just make sure I share my screen. So here, uh, can somebody just confirm that you guys are able to see my screen and the code editor that I'm sharing?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So what I have here is a trigger which is written. Don't just get bogged down with the lines of code that the trigger has, and we'll take it step by step. But this is one sample trigger that I have written, right? And let me just give you a perspective about what this trigger is trying to do. So this trigger is basically a trigger that has been written on a custom object, which is invoice. So I have two basic objects within my instance, an invoice object and a line item object, right? So an invoice will have multiple line items associated with it, and they have a parent-child relationship. So what this trigger here is trying to do is it's basically trying to update the statuses of all the line items for an associated invoice to paid when the invoice status for any invoice is set to paid. So basically, when an invoice is marked as paid, all its line items should also be marked as paid. And this is exactly what the trigger is doing, right? Now, there are two basic events based on which this trigger is written, right? So there is a before update event and there is an after update event, right? Specifically, if in for this case, what I have considered or what I have written the code on is only the after update event. Okay. Uh, so ideally, what should happen is whenever whenever an invoice record gets updated, okay, both these events, the before update as well as the after update events, will fire. However, because my code only specifically traps or listens to the after update event, the entire code here will only execute when an after update event occurs. Okay, the difference between a before and an after event is, so before is when a record is not committed to the database. Okay, and after is when a record gets committed to the database. Typically in an insert sort of a scenario, right now this is written on an update scenario, but in an insert sort of a scenario, when the record gets committed or on an after event, right, when a record gets committed, the record ID is generated. In a before insert event, the record ID is not generated. So that is how you differentiate between a before insert and an after insert. In update, of course, because the record is already created, the ID already exists. However, uh, before is basically it's not committed to the database, and after is when it's committed to the database. So let's just understand what this trigger really does, right? So what this trigger is really trying to do is it is trying to iterate over the list of newly updated records using trigger.new, and it is checking which of these records have uh, the status as paid. Okay, so invoice, let me just show you my invoice object. Hopefully that should give you a perspective of what I'm really talking about. So I'm going to go to object manager, and I am going to show you quickly the invoice object. So it's a custom object that I have built, and there are just bare minimum fields that I have, right? So I have uh, the name field, which is of course the standard, which is an auto number. Then I have the notes field, and I have a status field. The status field is nothing but it's a pick list, right? And it just has three values. It has an open, pending, and paid. So what I'm really checking is I'm checking if uh, there are any invoice records with the status as paid. Okay. Now what I'm going to, so in my code, switching over to my editor now. So the first thing is I'm checking if these particular records there are any invoice records with the status as paid, and then what I'm trying to do is I'm going to identify, or I'm going to capture the IDs of those invoice records, right? Once those invoice records are so once I identify that there is at least one invoice record with a status of paid, right? What I'm trying to do is I'm going to query the invoice and its associated line items, right? And then I'm iterating over those particular records over here, right? What I receive back here is a map, and I'm iterating over the map and trying to update the status of the line item records, right? And once I update it, I'm just actually, so what I'm doing is I'm changing the status over here, and then I'm just actually updating the record in this particular statement with my DML operation, which is an update operation. Okay. Now, what really happens is uh, So this is how you would technically write a trigger where the logic is written, and this works fine. So let's just see if this particular piece of code or piece of Apex trigger is working fine. So the first thing I'll have to do is go back and enable this particular trigger, because I have multiple triggers written on the same object. What for now, I'm just going to enable this particular uh, trigger and deactivate the other one. Okay, so give me a moment while I do that. So just for your understanding, whenever you create triggers in Salesforce, there is an is active flag which is available, right? So unless this is active flag is set, uh, the trigger will not run, right? So basically you got to make sure that one of the first things that you got to check is, if your trigger is not running, you might want to check if it is active or inactive. And if it is inactive, you might want to check this flag. So the easiest way to go about doing that is, go to the specific object. So if you're doing lightning experience, use object manager, navigate to the specific object, use the triggers menu item, and click the specific trigger, say edit, and say is active, right? So I'm going to save this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to also deactivate the trigger, because just for your understanding, we don't want a lot of noise. We'll come to this, what exactly this is. So what I've done is I have activated uh, the trigger that I just was showcasing in my developer window. Okay, just give me a moment. I think it's taking time to load. Okay, so it is now active. The status is turned to active. Okay, now what I'm going to do is, I'm just to showcase if the trigger is working fine, I'm going to switch back to my org, and I'm going to open up the invoice tab. Okay, so I'm just opening up the invoice tab. I've created a tab for invoice where I'm going to be able to see all my invoice records, right? So here I have two sample invoice records which are being created. So there is invoice one, which says, which has an amount of $500 and the status is open, right? And it has two related line items associated with it. The first line item is for a tent, right? And which also has a status of open, I believe so. And the next item is for camping shoes, which is also of the status open. Now, as per our trigger of whatever we have written over here, the trigger is basically what it is going to do, that whenever an invoice, okay, is marked as paid. So when I change the status from open to paid, okay, the related line items, which is the tent and the camping shoes over here, will also be marked, will also change its status from open to paid. Okay, so let's just see this as action, and let's just try to understand if this is working as expected. Let me just go out and clear some previous logs just to make sure that we're seeing the right logs. Okay, all right. So now the trigger is activated. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just run this. And how am I going to do that? I am on invoice record one. I'm going to change the status from open to paid, and I'm going to save this record. Okay, so the record has saved successfully, right? Now, because I have performed an update operation, the trigger here, which I have written, will run, and the same trigger will cause or will will cause the line item status to be updated. So let's just go back and check if the line item status has been updated. I'm going to quickly move to the related tab and check for tent and see if the status. So the status has been marked as changed to paid. Similarly, if I go and check the other line item for camping shoes, the status for that also should have changed. Sometimes it takes a moment. Just let's see if it's changed or not. So invoice one, let's see. So it has changed to paid. It just takes some time to reflect sometimes. So that's the reason why we were not able to see it earlier. So this is how the existing trigger is written, as per what we have been speaking about in our previous sessions. But there are certain challenges with this, and let's try to understand what those challenges are. Okay. See, whenever we write triggers, um, and whenever those triggers are written in a real world scenario, uh, there are multiple pieces of business logic which come and interfere with each other, which means that uh, for the first thing is, if you look at this particular trigger, right, which is written over here, all the business logic or an entire piece of code has been written within the trigger itself, which makes the trigger very bulky. Which when I say bulky, what does it mean? The implementation becomes very complex. As and when new logic will keep adding, the code within my trigger will get longer and longer. Longer the code, the more difficult it is to maintain, which means the maintainability of my trigger increases, right? Making any kind of change to a trigger becomes very difficult, because now you have to look at the existing code, right? Second, so maintenance becomes heavy and the implementation is complex. Another issue that is observed in writing triggers in the way which I have showcased just now is, you will also end up writing multiple triggers on the same object, or the same event for the same object. So you could have multiple triggers being written on after insert of an account, or like I just showcased, maybe after update of a specific object. However, the challenge with this is that if you have multiple triggers written on the same event of the object, right, or same object, there is no way that we can really identify or determine which of these triggers will execute first. So basically, there is no control that we have as as developers to to identify that which of these triggers is going to execute first, which means that it could lead to a chaotic situation. So for example, if you have two triggers called trigger 1 and trigger 2, right, written on the same object, maybe account, and you have a record being created in trigger 2. However, there is a prerequisite for creating that record which is being checked in trigger 1. Okay. Now, because there is no way in which I can determine the sequence, I could have the trigger that is creating the record fire first before the prerequisite is even checked, which means that I do not have any level of control in this particular situation. And this is something that, and there is no way to determine this. So this is one big problem that we usually have. The other problem that we also see is, um, often when we look at real enterprise level orgs, it is not just the functionality that you might be implementing, right? There could be multiple other pieces of automations that could be running. So one is, of course, other pieces of triggers, which either have been written in the past on the same object, or maybe are being written by other team members. But there could also be things like, workflow rules, or process builders, or flows which are manipulating the same record or the same object, which could result in a DML operation and could fire a trigger. I mean, whenever a DML operation will occur, a trigger will automatically fire. So the problem here is that in such a situation, if we are not really having a clear structure of how this needs to be controlled, it is going to create a problem. Now, what is this particular problem? This problem is termed as an infinite loop. So let me give you an example. Okay, let's say I have a lead record. Okay, and based on a certain criteria, I am setting that lead record to is active. Right now, the moment that is active record, I'm updating that lead record to is, setting that is active flag on that lead record. I also have another piece of logic which is trying to identify the lead score, compute it, and updating that lead score on that lead record. Right now, what will happen? Look at this particular situation very carefully. Now, what happens in this case is the lead record. In the first case, the moment there was a trigger, okay, I will have an is active, my trigger code setting the is active flag on the lead record. This is active flag will in turn trigger the logic of setting up the score, right? The score will update the lead record again, right? Because it will update the score field. Now, because there is a DML and this is causing an update, it will again cause the update trigger to fire. Okay. Now, if you see the pattern, this is actually a recursive loop which has no end to it. Okay, and this is called as recursive execution or infinite loop. And if you have your logic written in such a way, your uh, there is a logical flaw in how your logic is structured, and it will never give you the desired result from a trigger. So it is always important that we make sure that we have a method in which we avoid such recursive execution. Now, it is very common to encounter these loopholes in the usual way of writing our trigger, which I just showcased. Okay, and that's exactly the reason why we need a pattern, right, which helps us cater to all these problems. And this is exactly why we would be talking about an advanced pattern, which is a trigger pattern, which will help us address these particular challenges that I have showcased, that I just mentioned, right? So what exactly is a trigger pattern? So a trigger pattern is nothing but it's a design pattern. Okay, so what do you mean by a design pattern? Design pattern is a templatized solution to a common occurring problem. In this case, the problems are the ones that we have just highlighted right now, right? So when we follow this pattern, right, what happens is it helps us implement apex triggers efficiently, such that they help us overcome the common implementation pitfalls that we have just identified. And these design patterns are oriented towards making sure that the implementation challenges are addressed, right? So sometimes there are things which you encounter while implementing a certain thing in practicality, and the design pattern is really catering to solving the problems which you will encounter in practicality. Okay, so let's just understand what this pattern is. So this pattern is really referenced or termed as a handler pattern or a trigger handler pattern. Okay, uh, so it's either referred to as a handler pattern or a trigger handler pattern in the Salesforce world. So let's just look at and try to decipher what this trigger handler pattern is. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our original piece of code that we had set up, right? That we just saw a couple of minutes ago, which was uh, written where the logic itself was written in the trigger. We will try to dissect this particular piece of code into and try to mold it into the trigger handler pattern. So before we do that, let's just jump in and understand what exactly is a trigger handler pattern and how does this work. So the trigger handler pattern aims at breaking down your entire piece of trigger logic and compartmentalizing it, right? So when we say we compartmentalize it, we break it down logically into steps such that each compartment or each specific piece has a responsibility that it owns, right? In our original structure, if I just see, we had just the object and the trigger. However, in the trigger handler pattern, what we're going to do is we're breaking down what we had into the trigger into something that is known as the handler class, right? And then beyond the handler, we will also have other Apex classes which are more driven towards implementing a business logic or any utility function. So for example, what do you mean by business logic? Business logic means that, for example, let's say if I'm doing an financial planning implementation and I want to make sure that I put a rule saying that only people with an age of 18 years and beyond should be able to generate a financial plan. Now this is a business rule that I have put, and the code that implements this business rule is really referred to as the business logic, right? Utility classes are nothing but classes which are really referenced or utilized to perform some common reoccurring functions. For example, identifying the substring within a particular name or formatting a particular name. Some of these common things are generally referred to as utility classes. So what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever is there in the trigger, break it down into a handler class, and then further have that handler class call some logic from some of these Apex classes while keeping the same scenario, which was trying to uh, uh, basically change the status of all the line items for a given invoice to paid when the invoice itself is marked as paid, right? The scenario still remains the same. Now, before we jump into doing that, let's just try to understand what are the benefits of this particular pattern, right? And if you really see, uh, this particular handler pattern is basically compartmentalizing the entire implementation into three sections. So one is it focuses on the trigger implementation, and it kind of, because you're taking out things from the trigger, the implementation of the trigger. When I say implementation, implementation is basically the code written within the trigger, right? So the implementation of the trigger is much cleaner because now you have much lesser code. Then you have a handler class which controls the delegation, right? So this handler will be responsible for filtering the actual records for processing, and it will also delegate those particular filtered out records to an appropriate business logic class, which will be responsible for executing actions based on the business rules, right? So let's just understand how this handler pattern helps benefit and helps overcome the challenges that we have seen in our earlier triggers. So one of the first things as a part of this pattern is you have to ensure that there is only one trigger per object. Okay. Now, although Salesforce does not restrict you from creating multiple triggers per object, as a best practice, it is always recommended that you have one trigger per object. Now, the reason why you want this to be enforced is because when you have multiple triggers, you cannot control the order in which they execute, right? With this particular thing of having one trigger per object, you are ensuring that first of all, that situation of having multiple triggers doesn't arise. Second is it helps helps the code become more maintainable, because now you exactly know that whenever there is going to be a DML operation performed in that object, it is only going to have a single point of invocation, right? So a single point of invocation is much more maintainable versus when you have multiple triggers which result in multiple points of invocation, right? Second, because the way this handler pattern is structured, because we are compartmentalizing responsibilities, the code within our triggers is much lesser and much cleaner, right? Second is because we are writing very specific pieces of code for catering to specific responsibilities. Now the code becomes much more reusable, which means, for example, coming back to our scenario that we were talking about, that we have a piece of logic written to mark all the invoice line items with a specific status, right? Now, let's say if I'm writing a web service call, and from the web service call, I want to do a similar thing, I can call the specific business logic classes from my web service also, right? To do the same thing, which means I will not have to build out the same logic again and again, and I'm reusing what has already been implemented. That's how it promotes a lot of code reusability. Second is, now because you have a dedicated handler which controls the delegation of responsibilities to perform the necessary actions, we have a very deterministic sequence of execution for our triggers, right? Because we don't have multiple triggers, and second, because we exactly know, because triggers are evaluated top down within the event that you have mentioned. So for example, if you had a logic of validating a particular lead record before a lead record, some data on lead record is created, okay, you will have your validation logic being called first from the handler, and then the data creation for the lead record. So in that case, now you have a determined sequence, and you know that because it is always going to be, the validation is always going to be called before the record is being created. So you have a very predictable way, predictable execution sequence. And last but not the least, you can eradicate the occurrence of infinite loops, because now the sequence is very determined and it is very clear. So let's just jump in to our code editor and really try to see how we can mold our existing piece of code, right, into our trigger handler pattern. So we will have three basic pieces to our implementation, right? The first piece is the actual trigger. The second piece is the trigger handler. And the third piece is the business logic class, which is the service class. Okay, so let me just explain to you before we do this, let me just activate this particular trigger and deactivate the older one. So let me just go back to my Salesforce instance. Okay, I'm going to search for invoice. And I'm going to, so ideally when you implement this particular pattern, what will happen is you will only have, right now you have two triggers, but technically in the real world, it doesn't work this way, that you actually go out and keep deactivating triggers for running a particular set of business logic. So you need to have a method to the madness, and you need to have an order so that this all executes in a very controlled fashion, right? So what I'm going to do is now have my invoice trigger activated, which is basically a part of my uh, my pattern, my handler pattern, right? Okay, so my trigger is activated. Now let's go back and see. Now look at this particular, the first thing which is very clear, which is already there, is look at the code in this particular trigger and look at the code which is written in this particular trigger which is following the handler pattern. If you see, I'm still using the same event. It's after update and nothing has changed. Here also it is after update because the code was written on after update. But you see that this has only a single line uh, of calling, which basically calls the handler class, and this is very bulky. So in this case, it is extremely easy to maintain this. The only change that you might see otherwise is here I'm using an if statement to identify the events, but there is a fancier way of doing it. So I'm just using a switch case, which is now available in Apex. So I'm using the trigger.operation type, right? And after update enum to verify that if it's an after update event. And all I'm doing is I'm just making a call to my handler class. Okay, so we have, like showcased in our pattern, we have three pieces to this particular pattern: the actual trigger, the handler which controls the delegation, and the piece of Apex class. So our invoice trigger is the actual trigger in this case. Our trigger handler is the handler which will be delegating filtering the records and delegating the responsibilities. And last but not the least, we will have specific service classes, which is the invoice service class that I've written, which is very specific to the business logic, which is basically updating the records of line item object. Okay, so let's just go out and understand what has been written and then see this particular trigger in action. Okay, so this is the first thing. I've written this particular trigger. Now this trigger is making a call to a method written within my handler. So this is my handler class, right? And what my handler class is doing now is it is getting a parameter. So on after update is a method that I have written, right? So as per the handler pattern, what we should be having is there has to be a, a method for each event. So just like if you have logic specific to before update, you will want to add a before update thing. So let's say if I wanted to do a before update, I would say before update, right? And you just copy the statement and make changes. I'm just going to put a system.debug here just to make sure that you guys understand, and say update. Okay, now if I had to, let's say, make a call to my handler class and have some logic in there, so let me just add a method here and say public void on before update. So there will be a one-to-one analogy between these two methods and your calls, right? I'm just going to take this out here and put it in my handler just to make sure that the logic is right. And I'm going to say new invoice trigger handler. I'm not passing anything, any parameters for now. And I'm going to say on before update. Okay, so let me just say save. Okay, looks like we have an error. Let's see what exactly is that. And I will also need to save this particular trigger handler class. Okay, still says we have problems. So what is that? on before update. Okay, should be fine. Okay. And after update occurs more than once for the branch of the switch statement. So yeah, the typo is here. So instead of after update, this should be before update, right? So this is, guys, don't get confused. This is the same way of writing an if statement which I've written, and it's doing the same thing. It's just checking if trigger is after and trigger is update. So this is one way of writing it. The other way of writing it is basically use switch statement, because I just find it much more cleaner, right? So this is how you would go about implementing your handler class. Now within my handler class, what I have really done is I have passed the new map and the old map as parameters, right? And I'm trying to, so the logic or the process, the objective that I'm trying to achieve is still the same. It's only that I'm using a different pattern, which is the trigger handler pattern in this case. So the first step in our particular code was to understand or identify if there are any invoices which are marked as paid, right? So if there are any invoices which are marked as paid, I'm just going to trying to sniff them out and trying to get hold of their IDs, which I'm putting in uh, in a set. Uh, can anybody answer if as to why am I using a set and not a list over here? Any tries, any guesses? All right. Uh, yeah, you can answer, if you can unmute your mic and answer if you want, but I'll just help you understand the reason why I've used a set is because when you're typically using IDs, right? I want IDs to be unique. So I do not want the same multiple IDs of the same invoice record to be captured in my collection. And typically, if you look at a list, lists will allow duplicate ID values. So in this case, I mean, in this particular case, think of a scenario when I'm uploading data from a data loader, which Jitendra just showed a couple of minutes ago, and I could very well have duplicates in that case. So in that case, I just want to make sure that once I consider a particular invoice, I do not want to keep considering it again and again, because all the line items, once it is considered, all its line items will be considered for being marked as paid, right? Also, it's a good practice to use sets with IDs, because sets will only allow distinct values. Okay, so that's the reason why I have used a set. What I'm doing next is, if I find any of these records within any of these records which have a status of paid, what I'm trying to do is I'm just delegating the control from my handler class to my business logic class, which is the service class over here, right? So what I have done is this entire piece of logic, which was written here all at one go, I have compartmentalized it, and now we exactly know that if I find any relevant invoices with the status as paid, I am going to make sure that I send the list of IDs and what status for what those records, I mean, what is the status with which those line item records need to be marked as to this particular business logic method, right? Now, in this particular business logic method that I have, what I'm simply doing is I am querying the list of line items, okay, which is another custom object and it's a child record. And I'm trying to update the status, change the status of these particular queried records to paid, right? So the string that you passed over here, paid, is basically being used in this particular the p invoice status to set variable, which I'm directly using to assign the status value to the queried records, and then I am doing a DML operation here, an update DML operation, right? So this is how you would end up building out the same logic in a much more maintainable and a reusable way. So tomorrow, let's say if I have a, let's say I need to do the same thing from a Visual Force page or a Lightning component, or if I need to do the same thing from a web service, I can reuse this entire piece of code because all I have to pass to this particular piece of code is the IDs, invoice IDs of the records that need to be updated, uh, and the invoice IDs of the for the line item records that need to be updated, and the status with which those records need to be updated over here. Okay, so now let's just go back and see this data in action. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my Salesforce instance and go to the invoices tab. And this time I'm going to choose a different record, right? Last time we chose invoice 1. So here I have invoice 2. The status for that invoice is open. Let's just make sure that the related line items for this invoice also have a status as open so that we can see the change happening. Yeah, the status for the bear spray is open. And let's look at the other item also, which is repellent, and that also I believe should be open. So now if we go to the invoice and change the status of the invoice, the line items for this particular invoice will automatically also get marked as paid. Let's see if this is working. Okay, so the status has changed. We did not get any error. All right, moment of truth. So this takes a few minutes before this reflects. Okay, so we have invoice to, let's see the related record. Oops, did the status change or did the status not change? The status did not change. Let's see if the trigger fired at all. So I'm going to go back to invoice 2 and see if the related records. Oh, the status did change. Okay, so the status is now paid. Okay, similarly, if I go back to invoice 2, say related, and look at the repellent record, the status for the repellent record has changed. So let's just go back and try to see what happened behind the scenes. So let's just look at the logs. Okay, so let's just open up one of the logs and see what has happened. So one of the first things to notice is because I included a before update event, right? The before update statement from my trigger has also fired. So basically, the before update event fired, right? And it called this particular trigger handler method, and that particular trigger handler method caused the system.cbug steadybug statement to be printed. Okay, now let's look at the what happened next after the before update statement, after the before update execution was completed, right? So once that was completed, let's just go back. Then we have an after update execution which is started. So if you see, this is the code unit which is started, and this is where the before the method exit, which means that the before update statement has completed, right? Now it will execute and it will perform all the necessary actions, which will result in querying the record. So you see that the new map and the old map which we passed have been, those records have been passed over, and then there has been some processing done. And last, so we did a query on line item object and we retrieved 2 records, right? And then what we went ahead and did was we performed a DML on them finally, and we and those are the 2 rows. So it shows us 2 updates have been performed. So if you see updated is only 1, right? So one of the key things to note over here is, I think this also circles back and ties into what Jitendra was saying a few minutes ago, is that when we are writing triggers, one of the key things to understand and note is the triggers are always expected and assumed to be bulkified, which means the trigger pattern for a single record. Because technically, you will never have triggers being fired on single records. You could have data being uploaded either from a data loader or being pushed in bulk to Salesforce, maybe through an automation script or through whatever. And in that case, if you do not write bulk safe code, which is basically 2 things. One is using the right kind of collections in combination, while using a set and a list and a map, right? And second is making sure that any kind of DML that you are performing, right, is on a collection of records and not on a single record, right? So these are some of the key things in making sure that you write efficient and optimum triggers, right? Um, with that, I'll come to the last part, and this is a very important concept that I'd like all of you to understand if you're writing triggers or doing any kind of implementations on the Salesforce platform. So uh, I believe this is not visible. Let me just zoom into it. So when we say that, there are different artifacts that that exist on Salesforce and may execute simultaneously as a part of your implementation or as a part of your uh, logic that you have set up on your org based on your business rules and whatever is your sequence. However, all these artifacts have a specific precedence, and it's more commonly known as the order of execution in the Salesforce board. And it is extremely important to understand this particular order of execution, right? Now, because we're focusing on the trigger piece, right, let's understand some of the key things very relevant to the trigger piece. So technically we know that whenever there is a DML, which means that any kind of whenever a record in Salesforce is manipulated, either in the form of creating a record or modifying a record or deleting a record or undeleting a record, even activities like merging, okay, they will result triggers to be fired, right? But there is a way in which how these triggers, the first thing minute ago that we had before and after update events written in our trigger and a before trigger fired first, right? Of course, we did not have any logic. However, in the real world, you might have logic written on before update, you might have logic written on after update. Both will technically occur. So when we say system validations, things like required fields, format validations, which are inbuilt from object standpoint. So those system validations will occur. Next, what will occur is then there are duplicate rules which help you identify the duplicates, right? And then what happens is the record is saved, but it is not committed to the database. Okay, so this is one of the key differences. The record is not committed to the database, and then your after triggers will execute, right? If you have, and then you have another set of artifacts like the assignment rules, auto response rules, or workflow rules, which could result. So workflow rules can result in a field update, and when that happens, because a field update is again a type of DML, it could again, the sequence still remains the same. If there is a before trigger, the before trigger will fire first and then an after trigger. right? It will fire for one more time, okay, after the execution. And after that is done, you have the process builders and the roll-up summaries and the entitlement rules being calculated. Now, why this business logic or business rules being set? You would want to exactly understand at what point in time the roll-up aggregation should occur. For example, if you have a roll-up summary field which is, let's say, aggregating uh, the amount values from, let's say, the invoice line item records, and those values are not yet committed, okay, to your database, then what will technically happen is your aggregation will not occur. So you got to make sure that your sequence in which your business rules fire, or your business rules need to be implemented, align with this particular order of execution. Okay. And last, finally, is the records are committed to the database, and all all the post DML operations associated with that particular commit will occur. So this is in a nutshell, a very quick overview of how the sequence of execution is truly defined, and this is what has been defined by Salesforce. So we really cannot make changes to that. We just have to make sure that we comply with that. And if our solution, or if our rules are not complying with this order, then what we've got to make sure is we write our automations in a way that they become compliant. So you'll have to use patterns and solutions, one of the ones that we saw, which will help us become compliant to this. And with that, some couple of good resources which I believe will help you uh, dwell further into this topic. The developer guide is very exhaustive and gives you deeper explanation of how triggers work, especially about the order of uh, execution, right? But there is also a good developer blog from on Developer Force which explains about how. So there is a different pattern also which can be written using interfaces, right? And inheritance, basically. So using some bit of object oriented principles, right? So this particular block talks about that. The handler pattern that we talked about was a very simple pattern, and of course it has its own set of flaws, because one of the things is that there has to be discipline maintained in making sure that the trigger is not updated, and the changes only happen to the handler instead of the actual trigger. Okay. So but I definitely recommend, this is worth a read. um, and last but not the least, we have any kind of hands-on is incomplete without Trailhead, and there's a very good module on understanding Apex triggers, and it has an hands-on exercise. I would recommend each one of you to do that. And with that, we come to the Q&A part. So let me just pause my sharing, and let's see. I believe we may have a lot of questions. Um, so,
So you got one question being asked in audience, right? That why do you need a trigger if the process builder and the point and click tools are available?
Oh, okay, great question. All right. So the question is, why do we need triggers? Because even if process builders and point and click tools are available. Fantastic. Now, always remember that point and click tools offer convenience. Okay. The learning curve is much easier. However, there is restrictions in terms of flexibility. So when I say flexibility, is basically what I'm referring to is the what can I really do with that particular artifact. So what I can do with a process builder, or with a particular workflow is very, very limited. One of the most common use cases, right? I cannot write or I cannot have actions being performed on when records are being deleted. I cannot do that using any kind of out of the box point and click tools like a process builder or a workflow rule, right? Second thing, if I want to move or iterate over child records from a parent record, right? So this thing is also not available using some of these point and click tools. So for example, like I said, if there is a change happening in my scenario, I had a record which was an invoice record, right? So the change was happening on one record, but the outcome that was supposed to be reflecting was on a different set of records, which were either, in this case it were related records, but you could also have a situation where these records are not related or there is no actual relationship between these records. Then in that case, what we will have to do is we will need code so that, or we will need Apex triggers so that we can listen to the data, the change of data, and then we can use that to query the respective records based on whatever is the criteria, right? So deletion, trying to modify child records or trying to modify unrelated records, right? Some of these things are not possible using your point and click tools. And that is the precise reason why you need an Apex trigger. Although the thumb rule says that if you can do something with a point and click tool and with a trigger, as a best part of the best practice, go with doing it using a point and click tool. The only reason is they are much more maintainable, they are much more manageable, okay? uh, they can be easily activated, deactivated on a production environment, which is not true for Apex triggers. And the implementation time you would take for writing a trigger would be much more, because you would also have to end up writing test code for all the code that you have written, versus with a point and click tool you will not require that. So these are some of your pointers or factors which will help you decide whether I really need to go with an Apex trigger or should I be using a point and click tool. I hope that answers some of the questions. Okay, so I think there is a question from Michael which says, so you can't manipulate unrelated records with flow triggered flows and process builders. Yeah, basically, if you do not have a relationship, right, you will not be able to identify and manipulate the unrelated records, versus in an Apex trigger or with custom code you can do that because you can query any kind of record. That's the reason why uh, you know custom code sometimes comes in handy. And of course, even with some of these tools like process builders or flows, you can move, always remember that you can move from a child record to a parent record even when there's a relationship. But the vice versa, moving from a parent to child is not possible because you can't iterate uh, on child records. And that's where you will have to have you will have to use custom code. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Any other questions?
Okay, I think we are done.
Hello, Jitan, one minute. Jigar, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jigar, thanks for the wonderful session. I have one question. So we know that the triggers is executed in a bulkified manner, right? Does it follow the user context? Meaning, let's say you and me happen to insert 100 records at the same time, right? So will that take both 200 records at the same time, or it would be a different execution?
So basically, see, whenever technically code executes, right? Uh, when triggers technically execute, they execute in the super user context. However, with the pattern that we have mentioned, and because we are using Apex classes, right? We can use the with sharing keyword in those Apex classes to make sure that the context of the records being visible to the user who is trying to modify the records, or in whose context the code is being executed, is kind of preserved, right? So if you're just executing triggers, you will have a super user context. But if you're using an Apex class with the with sharing keyword, you will be able to use some of these. You will be able to enforce the visibility of the records in the context of the user.
So, Jigar, just to add to this one, right?
Yes.
So in summary, team, right, and Suman, most of us already know, right, that Salesforce Apex runs in the kind of the system mode or the God mode. Okay, with sharing is only going to fix your sharing to the record, but it is not going to enforce your field level securities. Or
Yes.
right, so for that there are many GitHub libraries available, which is normally used. So those using those libraries, right, normally the SOQLs are created dynamically, field level permissions are needs to be checked. So in short, the answer to your question, Suman, right, we have to do some extra steps in trigger if we want to force the context of the user who is performing an operation.
A little different question, Jitendra. I mean, what I wanted to know is, let's say you and myself both are system admin, and you are trying to load 100 records, and I'm trying to load 100 records at the same time. Okay. Mm-hmm. So my question was, will that take 200 records from 100 from you and 100 from me in a single execution, or that would be a two separate execution?
That would be two separate executions, Suman.
Okay, yeah, that was my question actually. Yeah, I got it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Good one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good question, team. So thank you so much for joining. We are going to have some of the advanced session after a few weeks, mostly the design pattern and these advanced. We might come back again to talk about the advanced trigger and some other patterns. So keep tuned. Please share everybody about Path to Code. If you have any feedback, or if you want to revisit any session, or you want to have some topic in mind, please share with us. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening and have a nice day as per your time zone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, team, for being such a patient audience. And thank you, Part 2 Code team, for being there. It's always a pleasure coming and speaking and sharing and learning in turn. So thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jigar. Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
So before starting, right, let me talk about the sequence of a batch. What is the concept of batch in Salesforce in Trigger specifically? So the scenario I have is, let's say we have a lead object, okay? And when I'm creating any lead record, if you see, the only required field I have in any lead is the last name and company, okay? So let's assume that I have to insert, so this is the Excel sheet I have. I have last name and I have, let's assume, company. And let's assume that last name is Zawan, and let's say company is IBM. Yeah, let's have IBM. And then what I will do is I will have another last name is Zatu, same company. And let's say that I have around 208 fields to insert, almost this one. And I will save this record as a lead import. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to import lead in Salesforce for this record. Okay. And this is the CSV file I have set. And what I will do is I will write a small trigger on the lead. So to write a trigger, like in the last session, Amit explained, what we have to do is we have to go on the developer console and I will go on file. I will say new trigger and I will say lead trigger, just an example. And the trigger needs to be written on lead. So this is how I have to do and submit. So now basic trigger came here, right? And I'm saying this trigger is only going to be executed before insert. All I am going to do is I'm going to say system.debug. I will say hello world. Okay. That's it. Now what I'm trying to, what I'm trying to explain here, right? How the triggers are going to execute when you are going to do the huge data load. Okay. So in our case, we have how many records? In our case, we have somewhere around 208. So let's see how we can use a tool named data loader. Okay. So I have a tool data loader. And I will say I have to insert a record. Okay, I can have auth in place. Let me log in. So the data loader tool is provided by Salesforce. Normally this tool is used if you want to import more than 50,000 records. Okay. So I'm logging to my developer org. Hopefully it will not ask me for anything. So that's it. Okay. I'm saying next. Now I'm saying that I have to insert a record in lead. Okay. And the file I have is on my desktop and file name is lead import. Okay. So again, let me just summarize for everybody who just joined. So I am going to insert 208 records, 207 records in lead. I have only two columns, last name and company name. I have a simple trigger written saying hello world. Now what I'm trying to see is how many times this hello world is going to be executed. Okay. And this is very important because Salesforce has a governor limit, right? And whatever the logic we are going to write in the lead or any trigger, we need to make sure that we know the implications of our logic. So before going anywhere, right, let me go on settings. And if you see the batch, I have a bulk API enabled. Okay, I will remove bulk API and I will say batch size, let's assume as 100. Okay. Okay. Again, it will ask me for authentication. That's fine. Allow. Next, I will select lead object. I select my CSV file. Next screen. So it is saying that I have to import 207 record. My batch size is 100. Okay. Can anybody in the audience confirm how many times that hello world is going to be printed on my debug logs? Anyone? So 207 records, only hello world statement and batch size is 100. So there are multiple options. Is hello world going to print it for 207 times or 1 time or 2 times? Anyone? Okay. So let's try. So I have a 207 records, which is I'm going to insert. Okay. Now my CSV file have only two fields, company and last name. I am going to map them. So company is automatically mapped. Let me see where is the last name. Last name is here. Okay, we will say okay. Next, the logs are going to be created somewhere. Yeah, doesn't matter. What I'll say, okay, create a log, a new folder saying path to code logs. So I'm getting some answers. Few are saying that hello world is going to be printed 3 times. Anyone else? How many times? Okay. Let's see. I'm going to say finish. Now what is happening is my data loader is going to read a CSV file. It is going to read it is going to read 207 record. It is going to try to insert in Salesforce in a batch size of 100. And we have written a system.debug on my lead before insert event. Okay, so let's try. So operation is in progress. If you see 100 success, now our batch size is 100. So what Salesforce is doing? It is making a multiple trip. So it's saying 207 record got inserted, 0 error. Okay. If I go on my developer console, I got 3 logs. Okay. And if I click these logs, right, I have one hello world. I go on second log. It has second hello world, and same the third log is there, and then I have third. So just think about it, right? Let's take one step back and then try to understand what exactly Salesforce did. And believe me team, normally in all of my interview, I ask only this simple question, okay? And if someone is claiming that they are a Salesforce developer for last 4 years or 5 years, this is a simple test, just checking that how much they know about governor limits and the sequence of execution and the batch effects, okay? So try to understand what just happened. We had lead total 207. We had batch size 100, okay? And then we have trigger. So what Salesforce is going to do is, okay, that API, out of those 307, it is going to create a batch of those records. So first 100 record, then it is going to send other 100 records, and then there is no 100 records, so it is going to send 7 record. Okay, so this is the batch size Salesforce has, 100, 107, and that is the reason this trigger executed 3 times. That means if I say, let's say something, insert list of something, right? Let's say I say just a pseudo code, list of opportunity, okay? Or I say update list of account, just an example, right? What is happening is this is one context, okay, for each batch. So whatever we are writing in this, okay, that is going to be executed, right, multiple times. Okay, so you have to be very careful. Whatever you are writing in trigger, think about the governor limits. Okay, so we are already making 2 DML, right? Insert and this one. And if you have joined our episode 1 of Path to Code, I have explained, right, that how to see the debug logs, right? How to see the limits, how much limit we have used. So for an example, if I open this raw log, the most important thing for me in any project when I do the code review is this section. This section will clearly say that how much I'm using in my debug logs, right? Or my transaction, how many SQL, how many DML rows, CPU. If you are hitting around 40%, that means it's an alert, right? You have to be, it's like a yellow. 40% if you're crossing, try to go back and see how you have written a code, what refactoring is going to be happen and everything. So team, that's all. about what is batch, okay, and how the trigger get impacted on that.